to continue with the psychological ideas that Augustine gives us, talked about the bile statement and what that might mean for us. Second thing, Augustine described the structure of the mind in a way that we've kind of heard something about before. If you remember the notion of the chariot and the horses and the chariot driver, was an interesting kind of Trinitarian / Freudian kind of description of the mind or of the psyche. Well, here Augustine offers his description of the mind or the soul, that same thing, psyche, mind, soul, all rolled into one thing. And Augustine, being a good theologian, says it's like the Trinity. It's three components in one, not divisible, all one substance. So he uses some kind of Trinitarian theology to describe the human mind, and he said there are three parts. There's memory, and there's reason, and there's will. Okay, so we have now a second way of thinking about the mind. We have a couple from we have one from the Greeks, and now we have our first one from early Christianity: memory, reason, and will. Now, Augustine goes on to say that the mind and the soul are equal. Now, I hope that one of the things you see is that when you and I could sit around and say, well, what's the mind and what's the soul and how are those connected and all those sorts of things, we could come up with all kinds of ideas and we could end up just as confused as when we started. Well, that same thing happened to everybody who tries to do that. So we'll see Augustine say, well, the mind is this way, the soul is this way, but the mind and soul are equal. And then sometimes it sounds like the mind and soul are exactly the same. So don't worry about being kind of confused by this, because it's a confusing thing. So at least at some point, Augustine says the mind and the soul are equal, but he pulls this distinction out and says, but the soul is immortal. The mind is not immortal. So he's doing a theological thing here that's saying what we're talking about in theology is different than what Plato and Aristotle were talking about. Their notion of mind, soul, psyche was somewhat limited, but the soul is immortal because it's the part of us that can conceive of God. The mind really can't conceive of God. So if we can think of God, if we can think of the eternal, that's only happening because of the soul. It's not happening because of the mind as an independent kind of agent. Okay? The soul is the only part of us that can think of God. Now, using this process that he called introspection, the soul reveals what Augustine described as higher truths. So he distinguishes between the soul and the mind again. The soul is immortal, so the soul is what we use to conceive God. Okay? And using this kind of introspection, looking within us, the soul can reveal other things that he considered to be higher truths, higher than reason. Remember, Augustine always says that faith is higher than reason. Okay? So he says through reasoning we can understand concepts like number or like the meaning of words. Okay? But we reach true understanding only by going beyond reason, transcending reason. And then here's Augustine's quote, and ascending by degrees unto him who made me, moving closer and closer and closer to God. So the closer we come to God, to ultimate truth, the more we know. Okay? Now, remember, the Christian church is going to hang on to that idea, but it's going to get modified a little bit by the influence of Thomas Aquinas. Okay? They don't really conflict, but they're slightly different. So Augustine says the soul is immortal. That's how we know about God. If we think of God, it's only because of the soul. The soul gives us higher, deeper truth. The reason, the mind, lets us understand math, language, those types of things. But we got to go beyond reason, and that's what the soul, that's what faith does. And it takes us closer and closer and closer to ultimate truth, which for Augustine, of course, is God, the Creator. Okay? sensory information, because it comes through the mind part of us, right? And it comes through the body. And remember, the body is sinful and flawed and weak. So sensory information comes through us to us through the body, so it's not quite reliable. Okay? What's reliable is this introspection, this understanding or awareness of the self that really comes from the soul. Okay? So Augustine is doing this mind, body, psyche, soul stuff, and he's always elevating faith beyond reason. He's always elevating the soul beyond the mind as the part of us that can do the ultimate things, where the mind is limited to kind of temporal things here and now. Again, it's very much like Plato. Okay, so remember that. Now, sixth thing. This may sound familiar to some of you. Augustine says, the way that we know that we exist, that we have a self, is that we doubt, which confirms that we're thinking, which confirms our existence. Now, quite a few years later, we're going to have a guy come along whose name is René Descartes. And Descartes is going to write this famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, which means, I think, therefore I am. Descartes comes to this same conclusion. Descartes decides, if I'm doubting, I must be thinking. If I'm doubting my existence, I must be thinking, which means if I think, I must be existing, which means I think, therefore I must exist. Well, Augustine does that too. Same idea. It's the beginning of phenomenological thinking, which is that notion that things are about what's happening to me. Okay, it's the beginning. It's one of the roots of existentialism, worrying about our existence, trying to understand whether we are here or not. It's also the beginning of psychoanalytic thinking, understanding the self. Okay, so Augustine does in around 400 or so what Descartes does later in the 15th century, 16th century. So, seventh thing. This is a big thing from Augustine. Augustine says that will is the most important part of the mind. Now, we look back here. He said the mind is like the Trinity, 3 in 1. We have memory, we have reason, and we have will. Will is that efficacious part of us, that part of us that does something, that has agency, that has ability. So Augustine says the will is the most important part of the mind, because the will is the solution to the problem of evil. Now, every theologian and every philosopher who's ever existed has tried to figure out how to deal with the problem of evil. And we're going to do that too. Augustine does it this way. And trust me, there's not a great way to deal with this. There are several different options that have kind of hung on throughout the centuries. But most people never find one that's really very satisfying to them. Okay? So Augustine does it this way. Augustine says the will is the most important part of the mind because it's the solution to the problem of evil. Because for man to be good, he must have the opportunity to choose good. If we don't have a choice, then we're not really good. Okay? That makes some sense to most people, that if I was a machine that was programmed by God to do good all the time, I really wouldn't be good, because there's no agency, there's no efficacy. I'm not choosing. There's no will to be good. Okay? So Augustine says for man to be good, he has to have the opportunity to choose good. And then he does this, which is an interesting kind of little thing. He says God didn't create evil, because Augustine could not put it together in his mind, like a lot of us can't, that God, being all good, could create evil in some way. So Augustine says God didn't create evil. Evil is simply the absence of good. Presence of evil shows the goodness of God for Augustine, since God would not have allowed it unless he could bring good out of it. Now, this is a little bit of a messing with the words kind of way to deal with the problem of evil, right? To just say it doesn't exist. It's not a thing. the thing that we identify as evil, that we think of as evil, is only there when we don't choose good. When there is no good, then that's where evil is. Now, that sounds good to some people. It sounds good to me sometimes. And it may seem like a good answer for you. There are some problems with it, though. What is total absence of good? What is total, what does that mean? What about when I'm kind of good? Is there kind of evil around? If I choose to do good part of the time, then am I partly evil? What if I'm choosing good, but the person that I'm interacting with is not? Then is there a battle between good and evil? It's a complicated thing. And Augustine's much deeper than this little paragraph, of course, so I don't want to mislead you. But like almost every explanation of evil, this one is not terribly satisfying to me. And I haven't ever found one that is. Now, you may have, but there are lots of different ones. Augustine basically says we have free will, we have choice. Okay, a lot of people like that because they don't like the notion that God has programmed us, and they really like the feeling of being in charge and thinking I'm a free agent. I can do what I want to do. I'm not sure that makes good theological sense in all cases. So it's difficult to deal with the problem of evil. And Augustine takes his shot at it. Says the answer for Augustine is evil doesn't exist. It's just the absence of good. Because for it to exist would have meant that God had to create it, and God couldn't have created evil because God's totally good. So in the places where there's the absence of good, that's evil. Now, let's see, I thought I skipped something here for a minute. I'll show you a few pictures here related to Augustine. This is in a little town outside of Milan, about 45 minutes outside of Milan. And this is where Augustine is buried. This is the church of San Pietro del Ciel d'Oro, which means St. Peter of the Golden Ceiling. The little altar above the altar in this church, the ceiling was layered with gold leaf at one point. It's painted gold now, I think. This is where the tomb of Augustine is. Now it's interesting because Augustine is, of course, one of the most important figures in all of Christian history, and yet his bones, his tomb, is in this little, totally minimalist, not fancy at all church, hidden on the back street, this little town 45 minutes outside of Milan. It could have been in the Duomo, okay, but it's very interesting. When we were there and we went to see this, it was even hard to find. I had a map that had it on it, but we walked through the streets and finally came down this little thing that was kind of like an alley and found this church. There was nobody there. There was nobody in there. The door was open. There weren't priests walking around. Nothing. Just totally empty. No cars in a parking lot. Nothing. It was like, there's nothing back here. But when you go in, this is where Augustine is. And this is the tomb of St. Augustine that's sitting up on the altar. It's incredibly beautiful. The actual tomb is here. There's a little screen right here where you can see through and see the box, the lead box. It's wrapped in chains that contains the bones of St. Augustine. Okay, it's in Pavia there. For a second, I couldn't think of the little city. And here's looking into the front of the tomb, and the little box is in here that holds Augustine, and it says body of St. Augustine. Now, so if you're ever in Italy, again, place you ought to go. You ought to go to Pavia. You can ride the train out of Milan, and you can be in Pavia about 45 minutes. Wander through the streets. find the church with the golden ceiling, see the tomb of St. Augustine. It's really, really, really spectacular. So Augustine is the first person we really have that really throws his hat into the ring and says, let's decide what we do with evil. Now these links that I have here, they may or may not work. I know one of them probably doesn't work, and I apologize for leaving it on there. One is a Saturday Night Live skit where Will Ferrell was doing George Bush and talking about the axis of evil. If you can find that, then go back and Google that up and look at it. It's quite funny. The other one is, the guy I just lost his name, the guy that's the pastor of Saddleback, Rick Warren, Saddleback Church in California. Rick Warren, who before, when Obama and McCain were running for president in 2008, and Rick Warren invited them to come, and he did an interview with each of them at the church. And just in case you can't look at this, I'll tell you about it. It's just kind of interesting because they had two very different definitions of evil. And Rick Warren says to them something like, what do you do about evil in the world? And McCain, the old soldier, McCain says, you defeat it. Something like you face it and you defeat it. And he says, I'll follow Saddam Hussein to the gates of hell if I have to defeat him. And so he takes this very straightforward, very military kind of, honestly, a kind of simplistic approach. And that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's a simple approach that says when you face evil, evil is real, you defeat evil. That's the only answer. Then when he interviews Barack Obama, he says, what do you do about evil? And Obama says something like, well, there's evil in all of us. And there's evil here. There's evil in the streets when we see people that are living in poverty, and he gives that kind of explanation. Now, I'm not saying that either one of those are right or wrong, but two very different ways of thinking about evil. One is it's this bad thing out there that we have to defeat. And a lot of people think of it that way. And then there's the idea that evil is us. It's me. It's you. We all are capable of evil. And maybe we still have to try to defeat it, but it's not an external thing. It's me. Suffice it to say that nobody has a great answer for this, and nobody knows exactly what to do about it. So I want you to think about this. What do you do when you think about why there's evil in the world? Now, I'm going to put this on our first real discussion board and ask you to write about it, so you will have some time to think about that and come up with something. I'll put it up this weekend, and then you can work on it. But I want you to think about this. Now, the reason this is important is not just because it's a fun theological, philosophical exercise, but because if you're a psychologist or if you're a person who helps people with problems, one of the things that you do all the time is deal with bad things that happen in people's lives. Bad choices they make, disasters that happen, illnesses that come. I have a relative who, a couple of years ago, her husband says, I want a divorce, out of the blue. She's devastated. Her kids are devastated. They had no idea. A guy that had been part of our family for 25 years. We all loved him. We're all crazy about him. And then one day, he's gone. And you know that. There are all kinds of things like that. Tragedies. People get killed. People get cancer. Kids disappear. All kinds of stuff. Somebody goes to war and doesn't come back. We know that happens. Well, if you're a helping person, if you're a therapist, if you're a pastoral counselor, you have to think about what you do with that in your own head if you're going to try to help other people. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have an answer. In fact, having an answer for your clients is very often the worst possible thing you can do. But it means you have to have something that you can do in your head to say, okay, here's this tragedy that's happened to this person. How do I think about that? Is it an external thing that attacked them? Is it something that they have some responsibility for? Is it social? Is it spiritual? Is it purely psychological? Is it cognitive? Did they just make stupid choices? What is it? Where did it come from? Because when you think of it in one of any of those ways, that is going to affect how you think you can help a person deal with it. Okay? So it's really significant if you're going to be somebody that helps people with problems as a career or even as a vocation. You need to have some idea of what you think about the problem of evil and where it comes from and what we do with it, or what we do about it. Because you can't help people well until you've thought about this some. Now again, you don't need to come up with a perfect answer. You won't come up with a perfect answer. But if you haven't ever had the guts to fight with this problem a little bit, you're not going to be as good as you could be in helping people. Okay? So I'll post that as our first discussion board, and then we'll talk through it on the discussion board a little bit. Okay? Now we'll introduce these guys, and then we'll stop. Some people come along a little bit later. You can see that we've gone from the 400s AD up to 1,000 or so. Okay, up until these guys begin to show up, Augustinian thinking is dominant. It kind of rules the Catholic Church from 400 to 1,000. There's 600 years in there where Augustine is the way of thinking, and that's what the church is built on. So you can see how important he was, what an incredible amount of influence he was, because for 600 or 700 years, the Catholic Church is all Augustine, okay? And still today, a bunch of it is Augustine, okay? But around 1,000 or so AD, some people start to show up who begin to do some things a little bit differently, who begin to kind of tweak Augustine a little bit. So a couple of those that show up are, well, first is Anselm. Anselm is famous as a person who gave us what's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. Now that's an interesting kind of an argument. We'll talk about it in a minute. But Anselm is an Augustinian, like almost everyone is. Okay, so Anselm is very familiar with Augustinian thinking, but Anselm says we need a little bit more. We need a little bit more emphasis on the reason. Okay, so what Anselm says is, Augustine, remember, gave us this notion that we have faith and reason, and faith is always supreme. Faith is always first, and then reason is a secondary thing. Well, Anselm does a little bit of a different thing in saying that we have faith, but our reasoning supports our faith. Our reasoning gives us more strength, more robustness in our faith. Our reasoning is a significant thing because it supports the faith. All right. So Anselm pushes a little bit at Augustine. Now, the ontological argument for the existence of God, for example, fits with somebody who says our reason should support our faith. Remember that ontology is about, does something exist or not? It's about being. Okay? So Anselm's argument for the existence of God is an ontological argument, which basically says something like, you should read it in your textbook, there's a little bit of it, but it basically says that God exists because God exists. Okay? Now that's hard for somebody who's not much of a philosophical thinker to figure out what to do with. God exists because God exists. Okay, there's some nuances to that. Okay, I can think of God, and so God must exist because God exists, but I can think of God and it's circular and it's difficult. But Anselm basically, if you think that sounds kind of weird, just think about what we hear in the Old Testament about God saying who God is. What does God say? God says, I am that I am. Well, God says, tell them that the I am sent you. Okay? So God uses this, whatever that is, this word, this Yahweh, I am kind of picture to say, I'm existence. Okay? The I am means the being, the existence. So if Anselm, I think, probably kind of thinks, well, if God can say, I am that I am, then he can say God exists because God exists. So you can struggle with that however much you want to. It's difficult for me. It's hard for me to get that to make sense in my head. But read about it in your book. So Anselm comes along. Just a few years later, Peter Lombard comes along. And Lombard is also an Augustinian. And he again, like Anselm, he really begins to say, well, Augustine was right. Faith first. Reason is really significant. And Lombard goes even further than Anselm and says God can be known by faith or by reason or by studying what he has done. Now this is a decent deviation from Augustine. Lombard has said, well, yes, faith first. I'm Augustinian. But then he says we can also know God by using our mind. And by the way, we can also know God by seeing what he has done. Augustine would probably have literally turned over in his grave by this time, because this was so foreign to what Augustine would have said. So although Lombard is trained as an Augustinian, he pushes way out of bounds in terms of Augustinian thinking. So Anselm and Lombard and a few others begin to emphasize something that sounds a lot more like Aristotle than Plato. So I hope you're getting this, that there's a decent connection between Plato and Augustine. Okay? But as we go into, the 9th and 10th century, we begin to see these Augustinian thinkers that begin to lean more toward Aristotle than they do toward Plato. And as they begin to do that, they begin to think more in terms of reason being equal to faith. And this opens the door for what becomes known as scholasticism. And scholasticism means learning in order to have faith. Okay? School, being scholastic, learning our way to faith, as opposed to the Augustinian idea, which is having faith so that we may understand. Now, Anselm and Lombard and the scholastics are going to say you need to learn in order that you can have faith. And that opens the door for a whole new thing, including Peter Abelard, and finally including Thomas Aquinas. We'll talk about Abelard and Aquinas next.